Before we get into our chit-chat, I just want to get to Mark Richardson. He's a Toronto resident who I remember coming to one of our committees, making a very nice deputation. He's on the line too. Welcome, Mark.
Good afternoon, councillors. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank
Hi,
you.
Mark.
You're here with Dave Meslin too, a fellow activist.
Well, I'm not an activist. I'm just a neighborhood dad who got sucked into this thing.
So what are you calling about specifically, Mark?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Budget Committee for keeping programs for at least the 2012 year at Fairmount Park Community Centre, which is in my neighborhood. I think everybody on left and right can agree that when times are tough, it's better to fix things rather than throw them away. So I want everyone on council to support my attempts to try and fix the way that programs, pricing, and access run for the recreation programs at Fairmount.
That's great. Okay, well, Mark, thank you. Thank you very much for your call. I think that was a very considerate comment to make for all councillors tuning in, as I know many do. Dave Meslin, what do you see as the next steps for the budget? Do you believe that council can get over, as we were just discussing before we got on air, sort of this deeply sort of partisan dynamic where we rarely even actively listen to each other in the council chambers? Do you think that we can actually start, as Mark said, work together and maybe, come up with solutions?
I hope so. I think the first step would be for people to start getting beyond the spin, because it really confuses people. I mean, like I said before, Ford's campaign promise was no cuts, which means the folks who are doing Stop the Cuts, like Victoria, who just phoned, that's pretty a community, that is a community advocacy group trying to implement the Ford platform. That is Ford Nation. No cuts.
You've mentioned a theory
that is
before.
Ford Nation 2.0. So, no, it's really important, because there was this idea last year that this huge chunk of Toronto voters, Ford Nation, voted for cuts. But he didn't run on that. It's an important distinction, and councillors need to pay attention, because there is going to be another election in 3 years.
But did Rob Ford not run on fiscal responsibility?
Fiscal responsibility means you're not wasting money. It has nothing to do with how much you're spending. You can bring in $10 billion and spend it well. You can bring in 1,000 and waste it. So talking about reducing waste and responsibility has nothing to do with whether people are willing to invest collectively in public services. Toronto is willing to, and the people who now are saying stop the cuts are very aligned with Ford voters, and every councillor should be paying attention to that.
Shelley.
Well, what people now know is that they had a different definition of waste than the mayor had, than the radical conservative agenda really has. When they talk about waste, what they really mean is they don't want to fund social programs anymore. They really don't want to do those things. My feeling about the city really dates all the way back to before I was even born. I see the taxpayer as my grandfather in a little white clapboard house in Willowdale in the 50s. His tax paying then was building that city that was growing up around his house. The dues that I have to pay now are to keep that city healthy, keep it running, and keep the people in it moving along. And that means that the types of investments that Stop the Cuts wants us to keep making are the things that build on the legacy of my grandfather, the taxpayer in Willowdale.
One concern that I've had with terms like Stop the Cuts, simple as that, is that it doesn't reflect perhaps the nuances, the reality that one finds when dealing with a real budget, as you have had as budget chief of the City of Toronto before, Shelley. For example, some cuts actually make sense. Sometimes there is redundancy. Sometimes a program just isn't as good as it should be, and there's something better we could be doing. Sometimes we've got 10 things and we only need 7. So, when we use rhetoric like Stop the Cuts...
Name one example. I'm not, and I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
So what are those? What are those efficiencies?
Those are the ones.
And what would they add up to?
But isn't that the job that we should be doing through the budget committee process?
Absolutely.
And also when we did
that was the core service review.
And the problem with the core service review, it was so hastily done. It was done within a matter of weeks rather than months or even a year, as it should have been done. Mm-hmm. And it didn't contextualize the services. So it simply looked at budget line items. It didn't consider, like, for example, okay, that's an underutilized library, for example. But it didn't consider maybe that's used by a bunch of seniors who need it as a community center rather than how many books are taken out. Same thing as I'd suggest a bus line could be reviewed as well.
Absolutely. And they were also firmly instructed not to look at revenue. Mark Richardson, who you just spoke to, blew everyone away when he came to make his deputation to the Budget Committee, because as a father at Fairmount Community Centre, he finally said, this is ridiculous. Let us look at what are the programs that should be running affordably in our community centre and what we are willing to pay for them and what we know is affordable by the range of people that live in the community around this community centre. Let us have some input into how you build that matrix. And we think we can make this community centre affordable well into the future, not just next year. He was sort of a one-man citizen participatory budget band. And he actually sat down and really put it out on spreadsheets. The mayor's brothers, his socks were knocked off. Doug Ford, who was a member of the Budget Committee, didn't know that citizens sit down and do that. They do. Let them in, say yes, and they will help us build an efficient budget for those services.
Well, when we come back, we're going to be continuing this conversation about the budget and a number of other items that have been in the news this past week. I also invite you to call in and be involved in this conversation at 416-872-1010. That's 416-872-1010. It is 1:45. Time for Newstalk 1010. Time saver traffic.
You're listening to The City with